Hello everyone, this is Wes Terasaki. Our Bible study chapter for today is Matthew 8. Together with chapter 9, this passage represents the narrative section leading up to Jesus' second great sermon in the Gospel of Matthew, and that is the teaching that Jesus gives his disciples as he sends them out in chapter 10. Now we begin to see Jesus in action. More than that, we see his authority. The same authority that amazed his listeners in the Sermon on the Mount now amazes his observers through his miracles. In our section today, there are 5 featured miracles, the first 3 having to do with healing. The healing of the leper, the healing of the centurion's servant, the healing of Peter's mother-in-law. Jesus' miracles are spectacular, and it's no wonder that people want to get in on the action and join the bandwagon. It's necessary, therefore, for him to explain the cost of discipleship. This is followed by 2 even more stunning miracles: the calming of the storm and the curing of 2 demon-possessed men. Let's go over each of these 5 miracles and fill in some of the background information about them. Then let's close our time by tackling one of the major subjects that arises in this chapter, namely the topic of faith. The biblical writers did not look at miracles as a disruption or overriding of the predictable natural order of things. They looked at them as works of God, extraordinary as they are, in a universe where He orders and sustains all things, the usual and the unusual. Wayne Grudem gives us a straightforward, uncomplicated definition. He says, "A miracle is a less common kind of God's activity in which He arouses people's awe and wonder and bears witness to Himself. If we believe that God created, controls, and sustains all things, then it follows that He can do anything at any time. Then miracles, though rare, are rational. We can be confident in taking them at face value. They are not myths, allegories, hallucinations, or amazing coincidences." Miracle number 1, the leper. The healing of the leper involves much more than curing a disease, whether it be leprosy or other similar disease. Even beyond the sickness and disfigurement, a person with leprosy in ancient Israel was generally ostracized from society. The rejection was overt and demoralizing. Their clothes were rent, their heads uncovered, their lips covered, and wherever they went they had to shout "unclean" in order to warn others away. Given this status, it is remarkable that the leper even approaches Jesus in the first place. But Jesus heals such a person with His word and a touch, even though His touch would have made him ceremonially unclean. Why does Jesus tell the man not to tell anyone about the healing? Perhaps He wishes to avoid the notoriety of being thought of as a wonder worker, fame that could undermine His true mission. And why does Jesus ask the person to go present himself to the priest? It should be noted that Jesus must have not only cured the disease, but also reversed any visible deformity, so the priest could tell that he was cured. The practical reason is that the leper needs to be declared clean again so he can rejoin society, but also the action is a public testimony or faith story to the priesthood. Miracle number 2, the centurion's servant. In this case, the person who has faith, and it is called great faith, is the Roman officer, not the one who needs to be healed. In other words, healing took place because of the initiative and faith of one person on behalf of another. This time the healing did not require a touch or even proximity. Jesus did not actually have a relationship with the person in need, but the centurion did. And it was a relationship of devotion by a man who was faithful and generous and loved the Jewish nation. We know from Luke's account of the same story that the officer had built a synagogue for the Jews, even though he was a Gentile, and he was looked upon favorably by the Jews. Have you noticed that the New Testament mentions Roman centurions 4 times, and every time it is in a favorable light? The other 3 are the Roman officer at the cross, he was the one that called Jesus Son of God. Cornelius, who called for Peter. And Julius, who looked after Paul on his voyage to Rome. To the Jews, the Romans were the evil empire, but to God, they were individual persons valued by Him and with the potential for great good. Miracle number 3, Peter's mother-in-law. The setting is the home of Peter in Capernaum, a town on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee, not far from his original hometown of Bethsaida. The house is apparently large enough to accommodate Andrew, Peter's mother-in-law, Peter, and presumably Peter's wife. Peter must have also kept his fishing equipment there. Jesus probably lived in this home part-time when he was ministering in Galilee. Peter's mother-in-law has a fever, an ominous symptom in ancient times. Jesus heals her immediately. The whole incident is described in just 2 sentences. Why so brief? Well, we find out from Mark that this occurred on a Sabbath, and Matthew may have wanted to give the impression that this was a private healing so as not to incur public hostility. This also explains why the sick do not show up right away, but in the evening, since sunset marks the end of the Sabbath when normal work activity can resume. Miracle number 4, the storm. The 4th miracle is one of the most famous and dramatic, the calming of the storm. I'm going to skip this event for now and come back to it at the end of the video when we talk about faith. Miracle number 5, demons. In the 5th miracle, we see our first real glimpse of demons. We find that they can readily communicate with Jesus, recognize who He is, and are subject to His authority. In fact, the first ones in the Bible to truly proclaim who Jesus is are these demons. Jesus commands them to leave the 2 demonized men and go into a herd of pigs as they request. Let's talk for a moment about demons. What do we know about them? Well, they are thought to be fallen angels who joined the kingdom of Satan in rebellion against God. Now, unlike God, Satan is not omnipresent, so demons serve as his agents throughout the world. They really exist, and they are working today. We don't tend to talk about demons much, or at least use the term. In fact, people today say devil and have in mind a completely mistaken caricature. It may be that one of their tactics is to get people not to recognize they even exist. According to C.S. Lewis, the fictitious demon Wormwood is told by his devil superior, "Our policy is to conceal ourselves." I do not think this will be difficult in keeping the person in the dark. The fact that devils are predominantly comic figures in the modern imagination will help you. If any faint suspicion of your existence begins to arise in his mind, suggest to him a picture of something in red tights. I think the Apostle Paul has a better description of demons. They are deceiving spirits. Demons can control people, though not fully, and cause psychiatric and physical illness, although the Gospels distinguish between demonic influence and physical sickness. Demons are ultimately doomed, as is Satan. As far as we know, demons do not die, and so it is uncertain as to why they asked to be sent into a herd of pigs, since they likely know in advance that the pigs will charge into the lake and drown. Or maybe they didn't know that. We know that they fear being sent to the abyss, mentioned in Luke's account of this story, where evil spirits suffer prior to being cast into the eternal lake of fire. At the end of the miracle, the reaction of the townspeople is telling. They asked Jesus to leave. Apparently they would just as soon have men tormented by indwelling demons so long as they could live peaceably with their pigs. So those are the 5 documented miracles in Matthew chapter 8. There's much more we could say about them, but in the time we have left, I'd like to get back to the 4th miracle, the calming of the storm. We passed over it before. Recall that as the disciples find their boat suddenly in the midst of a severe storm, they fear for their lives. Before Jesus does anything else, he points out their little faith. and links it directly to their fear. What does Jesus mean by little faith? Can we have big faith or medium-sized faith? How much faith do you or I need to have? Just barely enough? As much as possible? If we look at faith in the first three healing miracles, the leper, the centurion's servant, and Peter's mother-in-law, the role of faith is not uniform. In the case of the leper, he had faith that Jesus could heal him. His only question was whether he would be willing. In the second case, it was not the servant who had faith, but the officer. In the case of Peter's mother-in-law, there is no indication of anyone's faith precipitating the healing. So how much faith do we need to have, and what should that faith be like? Faith is small as a mustard seed. It says so in Matthew 17:20 and Luke 17:6. You actually need faith only as small as a mustard seed. You do not need great faith to accomplish great things. The phrase, such great faith, does not refer to a particular quantity, but to a quality of faith, says Craig Blomberg. So why would Jesus criticize his disciples as having little faith? Well, here little faith actually means defective faith, faith that is not functioning properly. Examples of that kind of faith could be relying on one's own ability instead of God's, being concerned with externals, striving for something outside of God's will, or failing to live by the faith we already have. Faith is faith like a child. Perhaps another way to say this is uncomplicated trust. The woman in Luke 7 who poured expensive perfume on Jesus' feet may have had all sorts of weird ideas about Jesus. She is not commended for her excellent theology. Yet whatever her ideas about Jesus, she had something in her heart which pushed her to express trust in Jesus. That faith, however rudimentary, brought about her salvation. When the Apostle Paul was imprisoned in Philippi, he shared the gospel with the jailer and his family, who subsequently became followers of Jesus. We do not know what the jailer in Acts 16 knew about Jesus. Surely it was very little. Most likely he had only just that night heard about him at all. To have childlike faith does not imply being ignorant or naive. The simile is narrowly focused. We are to be pure in heart. Faith is present. The faith that is important is the faith we have now, not what it was yesterday or what we hope it to be tomorrow. Our Lord wants our faith to be contemporaneous, a present reality. In Luke 17, when the disciples said, "Increase our faith," Jesus said, in essence, "No, you already have enough faith to obey what I just told you to do." Genuine faith is focused on Christ, not self. Pastor Wayne says, "I don't know what the future holds, but I know who holds the future." In the case of the centurion's servant, the actual healing is not in proportion to the amount of the centurion's faith, nor is it caused by the centurion's faith, but it is in response to his faith in Jesus as the one who can heal. So our faith is not the size of that which is within us, it is the size of that which is within God. And lastly, growing faith. Is it not remarkable that of all the people Jesus describes as having little faith, it is his own disciples? This happens 4 times in Matthew and also in Mark and Luke. But one thing we know, despite all, their faith grew. Little faith is a faith that sets out to follow Jesus, but is tangled by doubts and worries along the way. It is nevertheless an initial faith in Jesus that has the potential to grow. How can faith be strengthened? By looking at the faithful one, the powerful Christ. Seeing God for who he is increases faith. When faith is weak, look to the Lord and not to self. And do not worry about whether we have enough faith. What Christians are called to do is look into the face of the Father and pray what they do have faith for. Trying to work up faith within us will not result in faith at all, but in emotional persuasion or mere positive thinking. The late R.C. Sproul was both realistic and reassuring about faith, and we'll end with this quote from him. The Bible does speak of faith growing. In fact, it both grows and shrinks, though it can never be destroyed. Our faith in God goes through dry spells, and we cry out, "I believe, help my unbelief." In various seasons, the faith by which we cling to Christ can be stronger or weaker. The faith by which we are saved may be as small as a mustard seed, but that faith, however infinitesimal it may be in its beginning, can grow and become increasingly strong so that we become increasingly productive as Christians.